Well, hey everybody, I'm John Rethlin with Unpopular Wrestling Opinion, episode 26, and today's subject is intergender wrestling. But before I give my opinions, I'm going to plug Appalina WWE's video, where she talked very briefly about her views on intergender wrestling. It's very good stuff. It actually inspired me to do a video where I give my thoughts on this topic, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate, because I've never been the biggest fan of intergender wrestling. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't have a place. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that women can't compete with men and that women aren't legit tough. I'm not going to say that, because that would be downright stupid, quite frankly, because there are so many women busting their asses on the indies, in other promotions, in WWE to get better and to prove that women's matches can mean just as much as the men's matches. And often, that tends to be the case. Like, there, have been many times where women's matches on pay-per-views have been just as good, if not better, than a lot of the men's, even though the women's angles aren't given all that much. But the subject is intergender wrestling. I'm going to give you a great example of how intergender wrestling works, and it didn't happen in WWE. It happened in Impact. Tessa Blanchard versus Sami Callihan at the most recent Slammiversary pay-per-view that they did. I've never been a big fan of Sami Callihan. I find him to be a garbage wrestler. I don't think that he really knows what the fuck he's doing. I don't like the guy. I just don't like his persona. I don't like anything about him. I don't care for him. At least as far as his on-screen character. I don't know about him behind the scenes. I don't really care about that. I'm talking about in the ring. Tessa Blanchard got me to watch a Sami Callihan match. That's the power of Tessa Blanchard. You can tell just how good she actually is, and at a very, very young age. She grew up in this business. She has really learned and has gotten even better and is so goddamn dynamite. Great on promos, great in the ring. She was a bright spot in Women of Wrestling. That. Even though there were some really, really good women on the roster, Tessa was a standout there. And hopefully season 2 is going to be a whole lot of fun. But anyway, her and Sami had a nice, good, competitive, solid, hard-hitting match. Very worthy of the spot that they got on the pay-per-view. Commentary is a little bit ass, but I digress. That where it's women and men of equal stature facing off, I have no problem with. An example of what I didn't like about women's wrestling was when Umaga beat up Maria before she was Maria Kanellis. This was back when Umaga was feuding with John Cena, and yeah, that wasn't necessarily a great idea at all. And it was less a match and more just an angle where the bell rang. It was pretty goddamn stupid. That was an example where I'm like, okay, I don't really need to see that. I didn't really care for that. And I mean, don't get me wrong, Maria didn't get hurt. Umaga was a safe worker, R.I.P. Eddie Fatu. But that's an example of intergender wrestling that I didn't really need to see. You get other, good ones. There are some I've seen on the indies. I've seen like 6-person tags, where one had, I want to say it was Izzy McQueen. I believe that's who that was. I've seen quite a few indie wrestling matches, so you forgive me if I forget that, but she was there. And she was teaming with a couple guys. I believe DJZ was one of them. And it was great. It was great to see DJZ live. And you also had on the opposite side a woman named Hotshot, who I believe her and DJZ are engaged. And Hotshot was trained by Lance Storm, very good. I met her a couple times at the 2 Without a Cause shows, a local promotion near me. I met her at the 2 shows she was at. Very sweet, very down to earth, and very good in the ring, despite the fact she has not had a lot of professional matches. Seeing that stuff, she can work. She worked against DJZ, which must have been a thrill for them, because you can tell that they work well together. Obviously, as they know each other very well, but also you can tell, as far as professionals in the ring, they can put on a good match. When you do intergender tag matches like that, it can work, especially if everybody knows what they're doing and does their spots well and can put on a good, compelling story. That's where things are actually a whole lot of fun. Another one that I saw, it was Danica Della Rouge, shirt I got right back here. Actually, very, very nice, local talent who really is going to go far. She's very, very good, very colorful, very talented in the ring. She teamed up with a guy named Ravenous Randy Myers, who's a very, very, he reminds me a lot of like if you took Adrian Street's gimmick and put it in the modern age, and I meant to actually tell him that, and I don't know if he would take that as a compliment or not, because I actually mean it, as Adrian Street was a very good talent. But the whole point is, it was Randy Myers and it was Danica Della Rouge versus Travis Williams, who he's like a 21-year-old Canadian kid that people chant Justin Bieber at. And he accepts it and actually does pretty well as heel work. But you got Randy, who's about 6 feet, 6'1", maybe 6'2", Actually, it might be 6'2". And he's in, and Danica Del Rouge is a little shorter. And then you got Travis Williams, who's a little shorter, but a little taller than Danica. And then you got this one woman named Sloane, who's this friggin' statuesque, just talented and beautiful woman that that was like pretty much facing off against Randy. So you had an example of that. I'm not going to get too bogged down into it, but the whole point is when they had Danica or Travis Williams face off, or they had Sloane and Randy Myers face off, it worked. There was this point where they did this, thing on the shoulders where the people on top were doing the punching. Sloane just picked up Travis Williams just like he was nothing, and Randy picked up Danica, and they were doing this punch thing, this punch spot, and it worked pretty damn well. That's an example of when intergender wrestling can work. That was actually a pretty fun match, and I credit to all four performers, all four wrestlers for putting that off. I really hate to use the word performers, but to be fair, I mean, it's a sport where performances take place. I mean, I've just had to accept that when it comes to wrestling, even though I still see it as a sport, and yes, it does have entertainment in it. That was an example of where things actually work pretty damn well. Priscilla Kelly, who I love, I've seen her at a few Without a Cause shows. She competed in I believe it was a 6-person tag, and she competed against one guy. He was a DJ, the hashtag local celebrity, Steve Miggs, who hosts a show on 99.9 KISW here in Washington. Really nice guy too, by the way, and really tall. I think he's like 6'4", 6'5". And she's competing against him, and there was some really, really good shit. There was some good shit with some comedy, but also some good wrestling there. When you do things right and you have it where you don't make it look silly, it actually works really well, because then the women look good and then the men look good, and then actually it can work pretty well. Becky Lynch beating up James Ellsworth, which, nothing against Becky, plenty against James, because he was a goddamn weirdo and a creep, but that was something that worked. But sometimes, just a lot of times, stuff with intergender wrestling doesn't necessarily work to my specifications. One example I'm going to throw out of where women competing against men actually works, and then I'm going to throw out another one, is Chyna. When Chyna, when Chyna got to where she worked out a whole lot more and got to where she was bigger and started competing against men, and I mean, she was always attacking men anyway in 97, but especially 98, she, interfering in the ladder match that Triple H and The Rock had, a great ladder match that unfortunately Triple H got injured in and had to, relinquish the title. But anyway, once Chyna got into the battle royal to determine who would be in the Royal Rumble, she was the first woman in the men's Royal Rumble. And it worked. It actually worked, because, to be honest, they didn't have a whole lot of women at the time that could compete against Chyna that were of her size. Now, nothing against Ivory. Nothing against Ivory at all. Nothing against Luna. Luna was gone from the company by mid-99 anyway, and wasn't really featured all that well, because they had to have her be afraid of Sable. Poor Luna. Poor Luna. I would have chipped off a huge amount of money for Luna just for having to put up with that goddamn bitch Sable. But I digress on that. With Chyna, her competing against the men made sense, because there weren't any women that she could really compete against where it could be believable. And that's not to say that smaller women aren't tough, but just the way they're presenting it, her competing against men, even if she wasn't necessarily beating men. I mean, even though she did capture the Intercontinental title a couple times. That made more sense. With Chyna doing that, it made a ton of sense, and okay, all respect to what they did with her. I actually wish, even though I don't know how well it would have worked out, because I just recently watched the August 9th, 1999 Raw where Chris Jericho made his debut. That's the same episode where Chyna was put in a match against, I believe, Triple H and The Undertaker to determine who would be the number one contender to face Stone Cold Steve Austin at SummerSlam, a couple weeks later, or 13 days later. And Chyna won because Austin interfered and bashed Triple H's head open with a chair, or actually just hit him in the head with a chair. But anyway, Chyna won, and they were going to have possibly Chyna, win the title against Austin. Now, I'm not saying that it would have necessarily worked, but at that point, they switched it right after that. Why not just fucking go with it? Just go with it at that point. They just should have gone with it. And I talked about that in the retro review, which I will be having other retro reviews up at some point, just so you know. Now, back to the whole thing about Chyna. She, competed. She competed with Jericho. teaming with Jericho and then competing against Jericho over the Intercontinental title. Some of that worked, some of that didn't. I got my own opinions on Chyna's in-ring, in-ring, like, career and stuff like that. I'm 50-50 on Chyna, but I understand she has fans. But presenting it just as men competing against women, it worked more with her doing that. It worked more with Nia Jax being in the men's Royal Rumble, even though I wasn't the biggest fan of it because Nia Jax is kind of careless. And I will say this, if she actually was competing with like 2 bad or 2 torn ACLs, I don't know how the hell she did that. Credit to her. Hopefully she does come back and hopefully she botches a whole lot less. But her doing that made sense. And I didn't like her tossing out Mustafa Ali because Mustafa Ali deserves better, and by God, he deserves better right now than having angles dropped. But Nia Jax in the Rumble made sense. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that Beth Phoenix eliminated the Great Khali in the 2010 men's Rumble. But then there are people like, well, if there are women competing in the men's Rumble, then men should compete in the women's Rumble. No, that's not how shit works. That's not how it works. Integrating some women that are bigger or are of, different size than, other women that WWE present. And I'm not making a weight joke about Nia. I'm saying that Nia, as far as like how she's presented, her competing against men, I guess it's believable. I mean, I think the men wouldn't get hurt nearly as much competing against Nia because they get hit back a whole lot more. But then you get to the whole thing of like, okay, then it gets a little bit like shifty. There are people that throw out the domestic violence thing, it's the undertones for that if it's like a big man competing against a woman or a little woman, or if it's like, men and women competing. I don't necessarily agree with that if you present it well. Like if you present it with equal stature, it actually works. But yeah, I mean, I know I presented a bunch of examples of stuff I like, and I'm sure there are plenty I've forgotten about. There's one example I liked in WCW where it was Medusa basically getting to beat the shit out of Ed Ferrara, when he was the Oklahoma character, and that's what Ed Ferrara should have had happen to him. He should have been humiliated in every goddamn single second of TV time that he got, because Ed Ferrara's a goddamn piece of shit. But Medusa doing that, it just, at that point, I mean, Medusa was just getting paid. And I don't think she really cared. I know she cared about wrestling, but I don't think she really cared what she was doing. I don't blame her because that was an ass angle. But with intergender wrestling, the examples I gave you are ones that I actually enjoyed, but overall the concept is very hit and miss with me. I kind of ease back a little bit. And it's not to say, once again, to finish up, that women aren't tough, that they can't compete against men. I'm not saying that. But it's the way it's presented. If you don't present it well and you present it where, this little 5'1" woman's going to beat up this 6'9" guy, then how are we going to take it seriously with the 6'9" guy, when he's competing for the world title? And that's actually something I'm going to talk about in another video about, comedy in wrestling. If you make it comedic, okay, but then you have to make it a little bit serious. Otherwise, we're not going to take the women seriously. We're not going to take the men seriously. Having some haha in wrestling isn't a bad thing. But no derb, I'm not talking about haha Clinton Dix, because I know that's his favorite football player name, or at least like one of them. And it is going to make me laugh, and I'm laughing internally right now, and probably should end the video before I laugh a whole bunch on camera. But with intergender wrestling, some examples, like the ones I gave you, I enjoyed. Overall, I'm very 50-50 on. I'm not the biggest fan of it. But I mainly presenting those examples as a way for you guys to, have a fun discussion in the comments. So please let me know what you guys think, and make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Twitter handle in the description. And I'm John Ritlin, and I'll see you soon.